So for the past 2 weeks, I've been shooting with the Sony A7R III, and in this video, I want to talk a little bit about my experience shooting with Sony gear and how it compares to the Canon gear that I'm used to. So as most people know, I have always been a Canon shooter. I've shot Canon since I started photography. Right now, this is my main camera. This is a 5D Mark IV. Before this, I had a 5D Mark III. Before that, I had a 6D. Before that, it was a Canon Rebel of some kind. And I got a chance to borrow the Sony A7R III with 3 lenses. I have the G Master 16-35 f2.8, the G Master 70-200 f2.8, and the 100-400 G Master. So I'm going to admit, going into this, I was kind of hoping to not like it. And the reason for it is because I have a shelf full of lenses back there, and I really don't I'm really entrenched in Canon, and while I'm not entirely excited about everything that Canon does right now, I am deeply entrenched and I have a lot of gear and I don't like the prospect of selling all of it. So having said that, for the past 2 weeks, I've been shooting with the Sony A7R III, and there are many, many things that I like about this camera. So this video is not going to be a direct image quality comparison between the 5D Mark IV and the Sony A7R III. There are better videos than I could ever produce about that very subject. Dustin Abbott has done a great job. Here's a link to his videos. Tony Northrup has also done a great job. Check out those if you're interested in direct image quality critiques. I knew what to expect image quality wise from the Sony A7R III. I knew that it was going to be a big resolution jump. I knew that the dynamic range and high ISO performance were going to be impressive. So that stuff, I kind of knew what I was getting into. What I was more interested in is what is it like to actually just use the camera, and what are the lenses like? So for the past 2 weeks, I've been teaching my Palouse tours. I've done a lot of landscape photography with this camera, and I also shot a wedding. I've had a chance to shoot with it in different lighting conditions. I've had a chance to shoot with it in the rain, and I've had a chance to shoot fast moving subjects with this as well. So let's just kind of go down the list and I'll give you my thoughts on how it performs in the different areas. So first of all, the size difference between the 5D Mark IV and the Sony A7R III is pretty substantial. Most of the weight savings that comes with this camera is in the body itself. The lenses aren't a whole lot smaller. They're still a large chunk of glass, but the body itself is a whole lot smaller. Hand holding this camera without a grip on it is just the tiniest bit awkward because you don't have really a place for your pinky. But if I'm in a situation where I'm going to hand hold a lot, using the battery grip actually makes it incredibly comfortable. And I think that there's not really a ergonomics loss, or it's not an uncomfortable camera to handhold, provided that you're using the battery grip. I found the electronic viewfinder to be, and I'm going to use this word a lot, a game changer. Being able to see your exposure and to see exactly what your shot is going to look like before you ever take the image is something that as a DSLR shooter I've never really experienced. And it's amazing. It is so useful, especially like in a portrait or a wedding scenario where it completely eliminates chimping of any kind. You never have to sit there and look at the back of your camera and review and make tweaks to your exposure. You know what your exposure is going to be exactly before you ever take the shot. Therefore, you're taking fewer test shots. And that's great for when you're culling through images. Really nice. It's a really nice user experience because when you bring your camera down, you're no longer needing to look at your camera. You're interacting with your subject in a portrait situation. In a landscape photography situation, the electronic viewfinder is incredibly nice when you're shooting in bright conditions. There's a lot of times when you're shooting and using the rear LCD that it's bright and you kind of get a glare on it. You can eliminate that by looking through the electronic viewfinder, which is so nice. And I really love being able to review my images in the electronic viewfinder as well. Having said that, I do prefer the rear LCD of the 5D Mark IV to the Sony A7R III. In order to get it bright enough, you have to put it in what's called sunny weather mode, which basically gives you a big jump in brightness for the rear LCD. And you lose a little bit of image quality on that. So I think the image quality on the rear LCD of the Canon 5D Mark IV is better than the Sony A7R III. But the electronic viewfinder more than makes up for the difference because the images look amazing in there. There's a few things going into this review that I kind of expected to be a little bit of a disappointment, or at least that's what I was expecting. The first one was, what is the focus system like? You know, I've always kind of had this thought that mirrorless focusing systems were not as good as DSLRs. During this review period, I had a chance to photograph birds in flight. I had a chance to photograph crop dusters, basically airplanes flying through the sky, as well as a wedding where people are walking around and moving and stuff. And I have to say that the focusing system is just as good as a DSLR. Maybe it feels a little bit better, honestly, than my 5D Mark IV. First of all, there's a million focus points, and the eye autofocus for portraits is amazing. It's another one of those game-changing things. I've set the camera up to have one button for back button focus, the other is for eye autofocus, as well as the button on the side of the lens, which Canon doesn't have. I have that set up for eye autofocus as well. And it is so cool where you don't have to think about moving focus points around or anything when you're shooting a portrait. To hit that eye autofocus, boom, it more often than not finds the eye. If it doesn't find the eye, it finds the face, because it has face detection autofocus as well. That alone, when you're shooting portraits or in a wedding scenario, it is so nice to not have to move focus points around or focus and recompose or anything like that. You just hit that, and whatever composition you currently have, you can just hold that and you get the shot. The focusing system in general is really, really nice. The only time that I noticed any kind of difference between the 5D Mark IV and the Sony A7R III is in those really, really dim lighting situations. There's a lot of times when the 5D Mark IV could find focus when shooting in live view, where the A7R III struggled a little bit. When you start entering those really dark blue hour times and when you really should be manually focusing anyways, 5D Mark IV is able to focus just in a little bit darker lighting conditions in live view than the Sony A7R III. Now, I will say that shooting the wedding reception, it got incredibly dark, and the Sony was focusing better in that situation than the 5D Mark IV was. So for wedding shooters that might be using this in a wedding situation, it worked flawlessly. It focused really, really well. And I was always happy with the focusing system. Another area that I was expecting to be pretty disappointed in was the menu system. People talk trash about the menu system pretty often, and frankly, when I first started using this, I struggled to find my way around. It is so annoying how different camera companies have different lingo and terminology for everything. For example, what is highlight alert in the Canon system is called zebras in the Sony, and what is called the beep, you know, the beep that happens when you're in 2-second timer, it's called beep in Canon land, but in Sony land, it's called audio signals. And just little things like that make navigating the menu system slow at first. But in the 2 weeks that I've had it, I feel like I have a good grasp of the menu system already. And it's one of those things that once you learn it, you have it. Plus, I love the fact that you have a My Menu customizable area where you can put all of the things that you might need from the deeper menu into its own section. That way you can quickly go in and access what you use. Because honestly, there's a lot in this menu system that you're most often not going to need. I wish that the Sony did have an internal intervalometer. Sony A7R III no longer has that feature on the built into the camera, so you have to use an external intervalometer. Another thing is, I wish that the touch functionality was as good as it is on the Canon. Canon touchscreen functionality is pretty good, really. Like when you're in live view, you can touch the back of your LCD and it will focus and take the photo there. In Sony land, you can touch and it'll move your focus point, but it won't actually focus and take the photo. So if you're listening Sony, I think that's something that could definitely be improved. Also, when you're in menus, it'd be really nice to be able to just quickly grab what it is that you're wanting to do. To use touch functionality inside the menus would be really useful as well. So probably the area that I experienced the biggest difference between the Canon system and the Sony system is image quality. The image quality is amazing. Being able to punch in 100% and see so much more resolution and just so much more sharpness than on the Canon, that's really when I started falling in love with this camera, because you gain so much more resolution. There are so many situations where gaining that amount of resolution is useful. If you're a landscape photographer, you can make bigger prints. If you're a wildlife photographer, you can crop in more and still maintain sharpness. The images are not only higher resolution, but they're way sharper too. The details are just crisper and sharper because of losing that AA filter. And to be able to gain that kind of resolution while actually gaining dynamic range and gaining high ISO performance and in a smaller package is amazing. When I noticed the biggest difference between these two cameras is when I got used to the Sony and then I went back and started shooting with my Canon, and it suddenly felt like a big, heavy, slow brick of a camera with less image quality. And that's really when you notice it, is when you get used to this one and then you hold this one and shoot with it for a while. The Canon 5D Mark IV feels so much slower. It feels bigger and bulkier, and the images that come out of it just aren't quite as sharp or impressive. I do really like the colors that come out of Canon. Like, it feels like the picture styles, you know, the picture that you see straight on the back of the LCD are just always a little bit more pleasing. So if you're one of those very rare people that shoot in JPEG, you're gonna like the Canon files more. But the Sony files are so much more detailed, and they might take a little bit more color tweaking or a little bit more attention to color, but you're gaining so much image quality with dynamic range, high ISO performance, and just the resolution. The files that come out of this Sony are incredible. Not only that, but the video aspect of this. I'm shooting a whole lot more video these days because of my YouTube channel, and the video blows away the Canon. Like, to be able to shoot in 4K and to have all the features, I would say that the dual pixel AF in the Canon works maybe a tiny bit better, but the Sony autofocus is plenty good. There's very few things that I prefer the Canon over the Sony, and I went into this review expecting there to be some pretty serious shortcomings. An interesting story about battery life. I shot a wedding, like I said, with the Sony A7R III, and I was using the battery grip when I did it. They only sent me 2 batteries with this package, and so I was really trying to get by with just those 2 batteries for this entire wedding, which I was there for 10 hours total. I noticed that my battery life was getting down to like 2%. I was like 7 hours in, and then I realized that, oh, that is only one of the 2 batteries in there, because it draws down one battery than the other. And so I easily shot a 10-hour wedding with just the 2 batteries, and I had only gone through maybe, I don't know, 20% of the second battery. So in a battery and a third, I shot a 10-hour wedding, no problem. There's no way I could have done that with a 5D Mark IV. In fact, my second shooter that was using the 5D Mark IV went through about 4 batteries. So battery life on the Sony A7R III is miles better than previous iterations of the Sony, and I would say it's quite a bit better than the 5D Mark IV as well. So the big question is, and probably the one that you're waiting for me to get to, is Nick going to become a Sony shooter? You see that big shelf up there? That's most of that is going to be for sale before too long, because yes, I'm going to switch to Sony. I just feel like after using this, getting used to it, and then going back to this camera, it feels big and slow and just underwhelming by comparison. The Sony system is just more advanced. It feels like I stepped a couple years into the future by going from the 5D Mark IV to the Sony. The Sony provides better image quality. In my opinion, it feels like it's a better focusing system. The lenses, which I haven't even really talked about yet, are so sharp. The 70-200 is an excellent lens. Does everything you want a 70-200 to do, including having these programmable buttons on them, which you can either use as a back button focus or a face detect, or like, you know, a autofocus lock button, something like that. The lens that I probably liked the most is this 100-400. It's quite a bit smaller and lighter than the Canon version of the 100-400. I found it to be really sharp, and I think the combination of the 100-400 and a 16 to 35 is going to be a great setup for landscape photography. Overall, I'm just incredibly impressed with the Sony system. They have a new fan in Nick Page, and I'm going to be selling a whole bunch of Canon gear here soon and slowly making the switch over. So yeah, the Sony system has thoroughly impressed me, far more than I expected it to, and you can expect to see one of these on Nick's tripod moving forward. If you guys have any questions pertaining to what it's like going from Canon to Sony, let me know. You have to send this stuff back today, and I'll be hitting B&H here soon, picking one of these guys up. Thank you guys so much. Hopefully this has been interesting, and we'll see you in the next video. Take it easy, guys.